Many successful civilizations have two elite classes. They hold different complementary, incommensurable forms of authority: religious authority and secular authority. This usually works reasonably well. It's a system of checks and balances. Competition and cooperation between the two classes restrains attempts at self-serving overreach by either. I think this dynamic casts light on current cultural and political dysfunction. At the end of this video, I'll sketch how it has broken down in America over the past half-century, perhaps not in the way that you'd expect. In following videos, I'll go into more detail and suggest how we might respond. First, though, I will describe this dynamic archetypically, historically, and allegorically. Archetypically, the two elite classes are the priesthood and the aristocracy. They hold different types of authority and therefore power. Priests hold authority over questions of virtue. They claim both exceptional personal virtue and special knowledge of virtue in general. On that basis, they dictate to everyone else, commoners and the aristocracy alike, what counts as goodness in personal life and local communal life. Kings, or more generally a secular ruling class, hold authority over the public sphere. They claim to exercise that power nobly. They may consider that is due to innate factors or strenuous personal development or both. That would justify a legitimate monopoly on the use of violence and authority to dictate the forms of economic and public life. This typically leads to an uneasy power balance. The two classes need each other, but they are also in perpetual competition. Priests provide popular support to the aristocracy by declaring that they rule by divine right, or proclaim that the gods are angry with aristocratic actions, so virtue demands opposing them. Priests reassure aristocrats that they personally will have a good afterlife, or warn of a bad one if they don't do what priests say they should. Priests depend on the aristocracy for most of their funding, for protection, and for favorable legislation. The aristocracy can increase or decrease that, or threaten to. It's extremely difficult for either class to displace the other entirely. Things generally seem to go better when they cooperate, especially when priests are in fact reasonably virtuous and the nobility are reasonably noble. Otherwise, they may collude with each other against everyone else. Sometimes, though, one side or the other is dominant and subordinates or even entirely eliminates the other class. Theocracy, in which priests usurp the role of secular rulers, does not go well. Priests try to increase their authority by inventing new demands of virtue. In the absence of secular restraining power, there is no limit to this. Most people do not want to be saints. When priests seize secular power, they unceasingly punish everyone for trivial or imaginary moral infractions. This is the current situation in Iran, for example. It's bad for everyone except for the priests. I expect it is unsustainable in the long run. Eventually there comes a coup, a revolt, a revolution, and the priests get defenestrated. Defenestrated is a fancy word for thrown out of the window. Secular rulers taking full control of religion also does not go well. A classic example is Henry VIII. He rejected the Pope's supreme religious authority and seized control of the church. He confiscated its lands and wealth, dissolved its institutions, and summarily executed much of its leadership. He was able to do that through a combination of personal charisma, the power and wealth that came with kingship, and the flagrant corruption of the church itself, which deprived it of broad popular support. After clobbering the church, Henry's reign, unconstrained by virtue, was arbitrary, brutal, and extraordinarily self-interested. Economic disaster and political chaos followed. Henry was succeeded by his daughter Mary, England's first queen regnant, meaning one who rules in her own right. She used her father's tactics to reverse his own actions. She restored the church's power through brutal and arbitrary executions. For this she is known as Bloody Mary. She was succeeded by her younger sister Elizabeth I. Elizabeth reversed Mary's actions. She established the new Church of England, which she designed as a series of pragmatic compromises between Catholic and Protestant extremists. Elizabeth was, on the whole, a wise, just, and noble ruler, which demonstrates that the archetype of a good king has no great respect for gender. Likewise, the reign of Bloody Mary demonstrates that women are not necessarily kinder, gentler rulers than men. Allegorically, archetypically, such colorful history can inform our understanding of current conundrums. You might review what I've just said and consider what it might say about American public life in 2025. Now I will sketch some more recent, perhaps more obviously relevant history. On the meaningless.com site, I've explained how modernity ended with two countercultural movements in the 1960s to 1980s. Those were the leftish hippie anti-war movement and the rightish evangelical moral majority movement. Both opposed the modernist secular political establishment on primarily religious grounds, effectively religious on the left or explicitly religious on the right. Both movements more or less succeeded in displacing the establishment. Revolutions can be noble. I think the 1776 American Revolution was noble. It was noble in part because the revolutionaries respected the wise and just use of legitimate authority. They accepted power and ruled nobly after winning. The American countercultural revolution 200 years later refused to admit the legitimacy of secular authority. Its leaders instituted a rhetorical regime of permanent revolution. For the past several decades, successful American politicians have claimed to oppose the government and say they will overthrow it when elected. And once elected, they say that they are overthrowing it throughout their tenure. This oppositional attitude makes it rhetorically impossible to state an aspiration to nobility. You can't uphold the wise and just use of power if you refuse to admit that any government can be legitimate. Nobility, then, was cast as the false, illusory, and discarded ideology of the illegitimate establishment. In the mythic mode, we could say that everyone became a regicide, a king-killer. After a couple of decades of denigration, nearly everyone forgot what nobility even meant or why it mattered or that it had ever even existed outside of fantasy fiction. Secular authority persisted nonetheless. What alternative claim could one make for taking it? There are two. First, there is administrative competence. This was an aspect of nobility during the modern era, which ended in the 1970s. Modernity, in this sense, means shaping society according to systematic rational norms. Developed nations in the 20th century depended on enormously intricate economic and bureaucratic systems that require rational administration. One responsibility of secular authority is keeping those systems running smoothly. Both countercultures rejected systematic rationality as a key ideological commitment. However, it was obvious to elites inside and outside government that airplanes need safety standards, taxes must be collected, someone has to keep the electric power on. A promise of adequate management was key to institutional support from outside elites during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That kept a new establishment in power. However, it lacked popular appeal. Managerialism is not leadership, which is another aspect of nobility, one that more people more readily recognize. And as modernity faded into the distant past beyond living memory, Later generations failed to notice that technocratic competence matters because we will freeze or starve without electricity. Accordingly, virtue has displaced competence in claims to legitimate authority. Initially, this came more from the right than from the left. The 1980s moral majority movement aimed for secular power, justified by supposedly superior virtue. Some American Christians explicitly aimed for theocratic rule. However, for whatever reason, the left came to dominate in virtue claims. They gradually established de facto priesthood, a class of experts who could tell everyone else what is or isn't virtuous. Initially, it claimed authority only over private and communal virtue, but increasingly it extended that to regulate public affairs as well. In some eyes, it began to resemble a theocracy. It did increasingly display the theocratic characteristics that I described earlier. And in punishing too many people for too many increasingly dubious moral infractions, it overreached, and seems now to have been overthrown. This religious analogy was pointed out by some on the right 15 years ago. I think there's substantial truth in it. However, I think they are terribly wrong about the implications for action. I'll discuss that in my next post. If the ruling class is neither noble nor even competent, but can claim only private virtue, then metaphorical regicide or defenestration for the priesthood is indeed called for. That's justified whether their claims to virtue are accurate or not. Whichever opinion about trans pronouns you consider obviously correct, holding that opinion does not justify a broad claim for secular authority. But now what? Perhaps there is some noble prince in waiting, biding his time, cloaked in obscurity, like Aragorn, rightful king of Gondor. More likely, some commoners will need to reclaim, relearn, and rework nobility, as did Frodo, son of Drogo, a decent, respectable hobbit who is partial to his victuals. Maybe that should be you. As I've pointed out before, you should be a god emperor. Maybe now is a good time to get started on that?